All right, everybody, welcome back. Our last topic that we'll take a look at in our study of our unit on industrialization is the formation of unions in the United States. Workers tried to form unions in the late 1800s, hoping to improve wages, hours, and working conditions. Business leaders worked with some trade unions, but generally opposed industrial unions. Strikes during this era sometimes led to violence, which hurt the union's image and slowed their growth. So, needless to say, you guys, the formation of unions in the United States has been a slow, arduous process, and certainly during the Gilded Age period, it was a difficult process. As for really the early part of the country, they weren't even legal. It was illegal to be part of a union, and then of course later they gained acceptance and so forth. But it was definitely a struggle with a lot of growing pains in the beginning. So I will hit on some of the highlights and some of the factors that really caused there to be problems between unions and the government and business. So let's look at opposition to unions, guys. Workers were required to sign an oath that they would not join a union early on. A blacklist is a list of troublemakers kept to keep people from being hired. So, you certainly wouldn't want to make a blacklist, right? That would mean that, you're on a list of troublemakers. That could mean you're not going to get a job not only with your own company, but if you go try to get another job, right? If you're blacklisted, that's not a good thing, right? So, but yeah, that was going on, right? If you had any activity with a union at all, you could potentially make a blacklist. Lockouts were put into effect by businesses. It was locking out workers and refusing to pay them. Governments generally saw unions as a conspiracy in restraint of trade, and unions were associated with radical Marxist/communist ideology. Let me just stop here for a second. In former courses that I've taught on world history, we have gone extensively into the teachings of Karl Marx and his ideas related to communism that began in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, so forth there in Europe. And, with his whole idea of the proletariat, the working class person, ultimately overthrowing the bourgeois capitalist, you can see why early on in the history of the United States that unions who represented the workers, might be associated with Marxist ideology, right? So that was one of the challenges right there, is the fact that unions had this connection and this tie, fair or not, they had this tie with radical Marxist ideology, and so they had to overcome that reputation. So that was part of the challenge early on. So as we move on, one of labor's responses early on, really one of their only responses, is a strike, right? And so in the late 1890s, you saw many strikes as workers began fighting for their rights. I'll give you one example right here. 1877, there was a railroad strike where railroad workers across the United States went on strike to fight for higher wages. Ultimately, the militia was called in. And the result, this is not going to be an uncommon result during that day, but hundreds of people died, millions of dollars of damage, and guess what? No gain for workers. So this violence, if you look at the last bullet point there, the violence of the strike only confirmed to Americans that allowing workers to organize was dangerous to society. So again, and you're going to see this story played out many, many times in different industries, different strikes where there was violence. Usually it did not turn out well for the reputation of unions. Okay, again, fair or not, that's the way it was perceived. That was the way it was portrayed. So they had to overcome that reputation. So early on, one of the early unions, I guess, organized in the United States was the Knights of Labor. They were founded in 1869. It says here they were the first nationwide industrial union. They welcomed women and African Americans. Okay, so an inclusive group. Hey, check this out, guys. They called for an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, end to child labor, and worker-owned factories. Most of those things are not that radical of ideas, right? Today, they were then. And they used boycotts and arbitration to improve conditions. arbitration is just when you negotiate, you bring in a mediator, and you negotiate between the two sides where you sit down and work out your differences. So, hey, let's talk about a couple other riots and strikes that took place during this time. The Haymarket riot, guys, took place in 1886. There was a rally held at the Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality at a nearby strike. Thousands of people gathered. And of course, look, the story unfolds like many of the stories unfold, right? You have thousands of people gathering, they're protesting, police show up, next thing you know, there's pushing and shoving, fighting, gunshots are fired, there's people who are injured, people are dead, police officers die. And in the end, in this case, 8 of the men were convicted, 4 were actually executed. Of course, the Knights of Labor, the labor union, was blamed. And again, another case, another example where the event confirmed the belief that dangerous radicals dominated unions. So again, the story seems to typically during this time period anyway kind of have the same end, right? So, and there were other strikes during this time period. In 1892, in Homestead, Pennsylvania, you had a strike at the Carnegie Steel Mill. In 1894, there was the Pullman Car Company that cut workers' wages, and so the workers at this car company went on strike. And really, in both these cases, again, you saw the government side with business, and they ultimately, put the strike down, and the strike collapsed. And again, there was no gain for workers. So, again, early on, unions, during this time of the Gilded Age, unions are going to struggle to gain notoriety, struggle for equality, struggle to gain influence, gain influence. But eventually they will, guys. Eventually they will. The American Federation of Labor was formed in the late 1880s, led by Samuel Gompers. Now, I should say the AFL still exists today. It's called the AFL-CIO today, but it still exists today, to this day. So it was formed in the late 1880s. I think it might have been 1886, I think, was the exact date. I'm not totally sure on the exact date. But, it was led by Samuel Gompers, who urged union members to stay out of politics, right? Earlier unions were tainted by their association with communism and anarchism. So, yeah, it was probably a good move, right? In the early days of the battle for unions, again, many of them were associated with radical communist or anarchist movements and the ideas of Karl Marx. And so Samuel Gompers comes in and says, hey, you know what? Why don't we stay out of politics and just stick to gaining rights for the workers? And it seemed to be a positive move in the right direction. But yeah, they pushed for closed shops. A closed shop is where companies can only hire union members. They tried to convince companies to recognize unions and agree to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is where both sides, whether it be management and workers, get together and they collectively bargain and agree and negotiate on changes and conditions within the company. And they promoted something called an 8-hour workday. All right. Women as well. You guys, women as well began getting involved in organized labor. By 1900, women made up 18% of the labor force. What do you think of that? 18% of the labor force by 1900. Most worked as domestic servants, teachers, nurses, sales clerks, clerical workers, industrial workers in the garment industry or food processing plants. Women were paid less than men and were excluded from most unions. And then in 1903, the Women's Trade Union League was formed to push for an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, and an end to evening work. So there you have it, guys. Just a brief overview of some of the trials and tribulations and struggles that unions had during the Gilded Age to gain traction, to gain a solid reputation, and to really begin to work on behalf of workers during this time period. And it was a struggle. Hopefully from just a few slides that you saw here, you saw that it was a struggle. And, in some ways it continues to be that way. The history of unions has been a long, painful struggle. And, look, there are still, even in modern day today, there are still, debates over unions, and they're still in the news a lot. And, management and companies, still have disagreements. And so, but But yeah, so unions, but in large part, unions have gained traction, and they've been firmly established, and they have worked to benefit workers in the long term. So if you're in class, again, as usual, if you're in class, we will study the growth of unions, the history of unions, and the trials and tribulations that they went through in more specific details. If you are someone viewing the video that is not in class, hey, I urge you to look up the history of labor unions in the United States and just look into it in more detail and gain a further appreciation of what they have done to try to help the working class in the United States from the beginning of our country. So anyways, hey, I will see you back with a wrap-up video next where we will wrap up our discussion of industrialization in the United States. Bye for now.